Damon swayed with the movement of the subway. He had an angular face, with a certain steadfastness to it, a still expression that clashed with his spindly body. Only his eyes gave him away, jittering around the carriage and catching on every face. His hands, thrust into his pockets, groped at nothing. He was watching an old woman across the carriage. Her eyes were translucently lidded and fluttering, but her mouth was sharp. It was a worn face, turned towards the floor in permanent penitence. She drew her shawl around her head, and her face faded into shadow. Damon saw her bobbing with the movement of the train, and it reminded him of when his little brother would sit in the back of the car without a seatbelt. The memory clouded his head with laughter, and his chest felt heavy. The train pulled into the station, and Damon jumped for the door, bumping into the old woman and making a blinking apology. He looked for a second at the hundreds of competing heads leaving the train, flickering in the yellow light. He shook himself and pushed onto the platform, barely noticing the station flooding past him. The street emerged, dark and filled with cars. Numerous horns sounded like gunshots in the distance as Damon strode across the road, each one almost sending him off running. He smoothed his hands down his coat and made for their meeting point. The memory of the last time layered over the shapes of the buildings, and the bobbing motion of the old woman's head sickened him. Each corner veered and swept him forwards. Damon barely noticed the route, and he reached the final street panting and slowing. The wall beckoned, and he shuffled around the corner. Robert stood just ahead, outlined by a street lamp. His body was upright, tilted back as if it was absorbing the light. His profile faded into the street behind. Laughing preemptively, Damon crossed the street. "How long has it been? Good to see you." Robert jolted and faced him. His expression was open and trembling, but it sharpened quickly into a smile. "Too long." His face was long and serious, made ghoulish by the light. His eyes had a glassiness to them. Now they reflected Damon's grating smile almost perfectly. They would fade away sometimes when he laughed. Then they became warm and brown. They both stepped back, hesitating. "How is Lucy?" Good, you know." Damon broke off. "She's expecting, actually, next June." Robert widened his eyes. "No, really? That's beautiful, Damon, that's..." He looked off into the far distance. Really, that's wonderful. Send my love." Damon nodded, half smiling. There was something about standing there with Robert. He almost didn't believe he was having a baby at all. He couldn't even picture Lucy's face. It receded, grey and dull, like rotten fruit. "And how are things with..." "Oh, good, yeah, good." Robert's mouth softened. "Yeah, we might be getting a new place this year." "Oh, whereabouts?" "Pollock Shields. It's a lovely place. Yeah, lovely high ceilings and everything, you know." "Ah, yeah, of course. Yeah, that sounds great." "No, it is. It really is." Robert sighed and smiled, and Damon heard him tapping his coat with his fingernails. The night was hot, and the air pressed into his brow, which pooled with sweat. Shall we go to the..." Yeah, of course, yeah." Robert laughed harshly. The orange glow of the pub wrapped around them. Robert kept turning his pint, and the condensation of the glass was thick with fingerprints. They were mostly silent. Damon was mesmerized by the rim of the beer. It seemed to collapse all of their meetings into a single ring, an untouched glass, Damon's intermittent half-laughs at Robert's jokes, the street darkening and making the pub feel like a stage set for a performance. He could hear his breathing as if it was being blown back into his face. "Robert." He left off from his glass for a second and looked up. "Do you remember when Mum used to drive us back from the supermarket and you would sit in the back seat without a belt?" His eyes flickered upwards. No, I don't think. Not really." "You would bob around like a duck and fall over whenever he turned, Damon smiled. I would sit in the front because I was older. Right. The smile strained the edges of Robert's lips. Damon stared at him. And then Mum would try and tell you off, but she'd always be laughing at the same time. Robert kept spinning the pint. His fingertips were white, and his eyes poured into the orange liquid. So you would go flying in the back seat. Damon chuckled and felt sick. And then we'd all be laughing. The glass spun off the table and smashed on the floor. Beer seeped from the shards, turning black against the red tiles. Damon fell backwards in his seat, searching for breath. He felt like the glass was sinking into his face. Robert's eyes were warm. They walked out of the pub. The street was dark and cars echoed in the distance. Robert was staring at the floor, striding towards the station as Damon struggled to keep up. They didn't speak now. The night became silent and formless like so many others. It was like a cauterized wound, layers of skin smoothing over its shape as Damon exhaled slowly. The memory in the car was the same. He only had a shapeless copy. The streetlights moulded Robert's stiff profile endlessly. It seemed to melt away, softening and shrinking. Damon gave up and watched the ground passing by. The station was loud and bright. As they were about to split off, they turned to face each other. Neither looked up. "Well, I hope I see you soon," Damon offered. Yeah, of course, soon." Robert lifted his head, and they met eyes. His seemed so vulnerable, dilating in the harsh light, wrinkling slightly at the edges like they used to when he was a toddler. His pupils were dark. Both of them smiled and walked away. Damon felt his eyes aching.